On a calm autumn morning in 1939, deep inside Berlin's Reich Air Ministry, confidence filled the conference room like cigar smoke. Senior Luftwaffe engineers had gathered to evaluate Allied aircraft technology, and when Britain's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine came up for discussion, the verdict was swift and dismissive. Liquid-cooled. Obsolete. Vulnerable. Wilhelm Gundermann, a respected technical officer, studied reconnaissance photographs of the Merlin and wrote a note that history would later mock. Liquid cooling represents outdated engineering philosophy. Heads nodded around the table. Germany, they believed, had already moved beyond such thinking. Their faith lay in air-cooled radial engines. The logic seemed sound. Radials could absorb punishment. A bullet through a coolant line could kill a liquid-cooled engine in seconds, while a radial might lose a cylinder and keep running. This belief shaped the Luftwaffe's fighter doctrine, from early Focke-Wulf designs to massive investments in BMW radial power plants. But technical preference wasn't the real issue. What truly blinded German engineers was success. By the late 1930s, Germany's aviation industry had every reason to feel superior. They had pioneered all-metal aircraft construction, fielded devastating cannon armament, and produced what many considered the world's finest fighter, the Bf 109. When German test pilots flew it against foreign designs in 1936, the results reinforced a dangerous assumption: they had nothing left to learn. Captured wartime documents reveal just how complete the misjudgment was. A 1940 Luftwaffe technical report dismissed the Merlin as overly complex, dependent on delicate coolant systems, burdened by radiators and plumbing. These weren't foolish men. They were skilled engineers following logic that felt unassailable. And so Germany doubled down. Thousands of engineering hours and vast strategic resources were poured into ever more powerful radial engines, particularly the BMW 801. The belief was simple: brute horsepower would compensate for any altitude disadvantage. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a very different approach was quietly taking shape. At Rolls-Royce's grimy factory in Derby, far removed from the marble halls of German propaganda, Ernest Hives led a team obsessed not with reinvention, but refinement. Bald, soft-spoken, dressed perpetually in a worn suit, Hives believed brilliance came from relentless improvement. In 1938, he recruited Stanley Hooker, a mathematician who would change everything. Before Hooker, supercharger design was guesswork. Build, test, adjust. Hooker replaced intuition with equations. He treated airflow as mathematics, not mystery, calculating temperature rise, pressure loss, blade efficiency. He could predict performance before an engine ever ran. Everyone understood supercharging increased power by forcing more air into the cylinders. What Rolls-Royce grasped, and Germany didn't, were the consequences. Compressing air generates heat, and hot air loses density. German designers accepted this inefficiency. Hooker refused to. His solution was elegant: cool the air between compression stages. By introducing intercooling and then a second supercharger stage, the Merlin maintained dense, oxygen-rich airflow at altitudes where other engines were suffocating. At 20,000 feet, German engines were gasping. The Merlin was thriving. By 1940, without radical redesign, the Merlin had evolved from a respectable 1,000 horsepower engine into a high-altitude powerhouse approaching 2,000 horsepower. The advantage wasn't durability. It wasn't simplicity. It was physics. Liquid cooling, the very feature the Luftwaffe dismissed, made it all possible. Ethylene glycol allowed precise temperature control regardless of altitude. It enabled intercoolers, stabilized combustion, and unlocked the full potential of two-stage supercharging. A Merlin at 25,000 feet ran as predictably as one at sea level. German engineers eventually understood the problem. Their late war attempts, like the Junkers Jumo 213, were extraordinary feats of engineering, but they came too late. Physics had already chosen its winner. And to understand why Germany never truly recovered from that early miscalculation, we have to look even deeper. Not just at engines, but at the mindset that caused one side to innovate quietly while the other convinced itself it was already unbeatable. That miscalculation followed Germany into the air. Radial engines, by their very nature, demanded exposure. Their cylinders had to sit directly in the airflow to shed heat, and that airflow created drag. More power meant more heat. More heat required larger cooling fins, wider frontal areas, and ever-increasing aerodynamic penalties. Designers faced an ugly choice: accept drag, tolerate dangerous temperatures, or sacrifice reliability. The Focke-Wulf FW-190D, powered by the liquid-cooled Jumo 213, revealed both the promise and the limits of this compromise. At medium altitudes it was formidable, fast, aggressive, lethal. But above 25,000 feet, pilots felt the aircraft run out of breath. Below 20,000 feet it could dominate. Above that, late-model Spitfires and Mustangs increasingly held the advantage. By 1943, this was no longer a technical debate. It was a strategic crisis. Allied bombers were operating at altitudes where Luftwaffe interceptors struggled to perform. Even the Bf-109G, equipped with a refined DB605 engine and a pressurized cockpit, couldn't match a Merlin sustained power above 28,000 feet. German pilots adapted, attacking from below whenever possible, relying on tactics to compensate for physics. Internal engineering reports told a blunt story. Liquid-cooled engines offered superior high-altitude performance, but Germany couldn't pivot. Production lines, tooling, training, and logistics were locked into air-cooled and single-stage designs. Retooling would take months they didn't have. Then theory met reality over southern England. During the summer of 1940, combat over Kent and Sussex turned engineering assumptions into life-or-death consequences. RAF pilots discovered something Luftwaffe intelligence hadn't predicted. The Merlin gave them choices German fighters lacked. Flying with No. 54 Squadron, Flight Lieutenant Alan Deer described engagements where his section climbed to 26,000 feet before German raids arrived. The Bf-109ES could reach that altitude, but not with enough energy left to fight. When RAF fighters dove, German aircraft attempting to climb away found their engines fading while the Merlin kept pulling. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Bf-109 had combat experience from Spain years before the Spitfire entered service. It featured fuel injection, allowing negative G maneuvers that briefly starved Merlin engines using float carburetors. German pilots exploited this advantage relentlessly, diving steeply while Spitfires hesitated. Yet above 20,000 feet, the advantage evaporated. Combat reports piling up at Luftwaffe headquarters were unsettling. Leading aces noted British fighters maintaining pursuit into altitudes where German controls became sluggish and engines lost responsiveness. Squadron records show growing reluctance to operate above 25,000 feet without a clear height advantage. The Hurricane added another complication. Slower and less agile than the Spitfire, it nevertheless destroyed more German aircraft during the Battle of Britain than any other fighter. The reason was reliability. Merlin-powered Hurricanes could be run hard for extended combat without the mechanical failures increasingly plaguing early DB601 engines. German maintenance crews reported alarming rates of bearing failures and connecting rod issues. Even worse for German planners was the Merlin's growth potential. Between July and October 1940, Rolls-Royce introduced upgraded Merlins delivering over 200 additional horsepower, while the battle was still ongoing. The Bf-109E, by contrast, had reached the practical limit of its DB601A. Meaningful improvements would require a new engine entirely, which wouldn't reach units until 1941. Fuel made the gap wider still. Britain's access to American-supplied 100-octane fuel allowed higher boost pressures German engineers never anticipated. Luftwaffe fighters remained limited to 87-octane fuel throughout 1940. Captured Spitfires revealed boost settings that would have destroyed a DB601 within minutes. The Merlin absorbed them without complaint. By September, the pattern was undeniable. The obsolete liquid-cooled engine was outperforming Germany's most advanced designs in sustained, high-altitude combat. Then came a telegram that changed everything. In October 1940, North American Aviation was asked an almost absurd question. Could they design and build a new fighter in 120 days? They delivered the NA-73X prototype in 117. It was a superb airframe, but paired with the wrong engine. The Allison V-1710 made sense on paper. American-built, reliable, effective at low altitude. It powered the P-40 successfully. No one questioned it. When the Mustang entered RAF service in 1942, pilots loved its speed, range, and handling until they climbed. Above 18,000 feet, the Allison simply ran out of air. RAF test reports were blunt. Outstanding below 15,000 feet. Inadequate above 20,000. The Mustang that could outrun a Bf-109 at low altitude became vulnerable higher up. One man immediately saw the solution. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew the Mustang and recognized the truth instantly. The problem wasn't the aircraft, it was the engine. He sent a memo suggesting a Merlin installation. 4 Mustangs were quietly sent to Hucknall. Engineers rebuilt mounts, cooling systems, and cowling to accept a Merlin 61. When the converted aircraft flew in October 1942, the test report underlined one word 3 times. Remarkable. The Merlin transformed the Mustang into something unprecedented. Full power beyond 30,000 feet. A massive climb improvement. A 50 miles per hour speed increase at altitude. Most importantly, it could escort bombers deep into Germany and return. American production switched rapidly. Packard built Merlins in Detroit. By late 1943, P-51s were escorting the 8th Air Force to Berlin, and Luftwaffe pilots were facing a fighter that combined altitude, speed, and range in ways no German design could match. An American airframe, a British engine, and a German assumption proven catastrophically wrong. By war's end, Merlin variants powered 38 different aircraft types: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance platforms, naval aircraft. The Mosquito, the Lancaster, the Mustang, all owed their versatility to one adaptable engine family. Germany never achieved that flexibility. Their engines remained tied to specific airframes, production lines rigid, logistics fragmented. By 1944, Allied factories were producing over 30,000 Merlins a year. German industry, under bombardment, struggled to produce even a fraction of that across all engine types. What began as an engineering preference in 1939 had become an industrial and strategic divide by 1944. And the final irony was this. Germany didn't lose the air war because they lacked brilliant engineers. They lost it because they optimized for the wrong future, and realized it only when it was too late. What happened next would decide the fate of the Reich itself. That advantage, once lost, could never be recovered. What should have been a routine engine upgrade for Germany became a cascade of failures. The DB605 was designed on the assumption that high-grade alloys, molybdenum, nickel, chromium, would remain available. By 1942, they weren't. Substitute metals couldn't tolerate rising cylinder pressures. Connecting rods snapped. Crankshafts cracked. Supercharger bearings failed after only a fraction of their intended lifespan. Maintenance logs from the Eastern Front are brutal reading. Entire fighter groups grounded, not from combat losses, but from engines destroying themselves. Serviceable aircraft sat idle while replacement power plants simply didn't exist. As materials declined, so did manufacturing quality. Pre-war German precision gave way to rushed output, dispersed factories, and slave labor. Engines left production lines with tolerances that would have been rejected outright in 1939, but rejecting them now meant surrendering the skies to Allied bombers. Junkers attempted an escape with the Jumo 213, a clean sheet design meant to rival the Merlin at altitude. On paper, it succeeded. Nearly 1,900 horsepower above 30,000 feet, advanced intercooling, impressive efficiency. In reality, it arrived in late 1944, in small numbers, far too late to matter. Even brilliant engineering couldn't reverse strategic collapse. This was the corner Germany had backed itself into. World-class designs meant nothing if you couldn't build them in quantity, with proper materials, and keep them running. Luftwaffe fighter strength peaked around 2,300 aircraft in mid-1944. On the same day, the 8th Air Force could send more than that number of 4-engine bombers, each powered by 4 Merlins, on a single mission. Design philosophy made things worse. German engines were built around short overhaul intervals, roughly 100 hours. The Merlin was expected to run 3 times longer. Germany assumed fighters would operate close to home with frequent. Packard, guided by American mass production principles refined by Ford, transformed the Merlin from a precision-built machine into an industrial product without sacrificing quality. Non-critical tolerances were relaxed. Critical ones were tightened. Skilled labor wasn't eliminated, it was embedded into tooling. Tasks that took British craftsmen 40 minutes were reduced to 4, repeated flawlessly. By mid-1943, Packard was producing 27 Merlins an hour. More engines in a single day than Rolls-Royce Derby had once built in a month. In 12 days, Packard produced more Merlins than Germany built DB605s in an entire year. And they kept coming. Durability matched or exceeded British standards. Costs were lower despite higher wages. Supply chains were distributed across hundreds of factories. No single bombing raid could cripple production. Germany had no such resilience. A single RAF strike on a wing factory in Leipzig cut fighter output for months. Ball bearing raids choked engine production because only a handful of plants could make them. American industry made Merlin production functionally indestructible. When the war ended in May 1945, German aviation engine development ended with it. BMW and Daimler-Benz fell silent. Junkers disappeared. Engines meant to define the future became museum artifacts overnight. The Merlin did not. RAF Spitfires flew operationally until 1954. Not ceremonial flights, frontline service. Lancasters patrolled oceans until 1956. Argentina flew them into the 1960s. Civil airlines kept Merlin aircraft in service because they were reliable, economical, and predictable. Racers pushed Merlins to 3,000 horsepower, double their design limits. They didn't last long, but they ran. No German wartime engine could have survived such abuse. Most telling of all, when Britain needed a stopgap fighter while jets matured, they designed a new aircraft around the Merlin. The de Havilland Hornet entered service in 1946 and flew until 1956, a post-war fighter built around an engine Germany had dismissed as obsolete. Even its industrial legacy endured. The production methods developed for the Merlin reshaped post-war manufacturing. German engine programs, by contrast, became lessons in what happens when you optimize for the wrong assumptions. By the time the last Merlin-powered aircraft retired in the 1960s, the engine had accumulated more service hours than all Luftwaffe power plants combined. The outdated design mocked in Berlin in 1939 outlived not just its rivals, but entire generations of aviation. And it did so without ever abandoning the principles forged years earlier, in a grimy factory in Derby, by engineers who understood that winning the next war meant preparing for the right one.